In a move that reverberated through the highest echelons of British royalty, Prince William executed an action unprecedented for an heir. He mandated the removal of Queen Camilla's official portrait from the Grand Gallery at Windsor. What ensued wasn't mere silence, it was seismic. The unveiling of its replacement, a painting so audacious and symbolic, fundamentally redefined the notion of royal loyalty. Before examining the deeper implications for the royal family, ensure you subscribe so you don't miss a single update. The directive was issued discreetly, without any prior notification, but to those versed in palace protocol, it struck like a thunderclap. Prince William, the heir to the throne, instructed his private personnel to take down the gilded framed portrait of Queen Camilla, which had dominated the Grand Gallery since her coronation. For many decades, no royal family member had dared to intervene with the royal portraits wing. Every placement was deeply embedded in layers of historical symbolism and tacit authority. Yet William's command was delivered with unwavering clarity and zero hesitation. The gallery staff, though astonished, dutifully carried out the request under strict secrecy. However, even within the secluded confines of Windsor, news travels rapidly, and within hours the silence erupted into a furor. Senior courtiers, many of whom had spent years safeguarding Camilla's rise, were outraged and demanded explanations. The prince declined to provide. Then came a leak. A confidential document titled Gallery Realignment Directive appeared on an internal palace channel. It bore only one signature, William. No co-signature from Charles, no mention of Camilla. The timing was meticulously planned. The memo detailed the reshaping of representation in the royal public spaces to mirror the monarchy's future orientation. This phrase alone caused royal watchers to descend into a frenzy. What did this future orientation entail, and why was Camilla, the queen consort, abruptly absent from its visual expression? The answer emerged during an unexpected lifting of a media embargo just before the final palace tour of the evening. A velvet drape was withdrawn in the Grand Gallery to reveal a portrait so stunning it left observers speechless. There stood Catherine, Princess of Wales, robed in sapphire, her chin elevated and eyes fixed forward, not looking upward, not submissive, but direct. The oil painting had been commissioned in absolute secrecy, with even the majority of the royal collection staff unaware of its existence. Rumors circulated that William had initiated the commission during a personal moment of crisis almost a year prior. The choice to unveil it now, in the exact position where Camilla's image had previously resided, was entirely intentional. It was a deliberate public revision of the royal visual narrative. Camilla's removal was about far more than just wall space. It concerned hierarchy, influence, and public memory. For years, Camilla's presence in the Grand Gallery was viewed as the ultimate confirmation that her transformation from controversial consort to accepted queen was finalized. To remove her was to nullify that achievement. To replace her with Catherine was to convey a message even more defiant. The future of the crown would not be subjected to negotiation. It would be unilaterally declared.
As murmurs circulated through the halls of Windsor and Clarence House remained in stunned silence, one response held more significance than all others. The King, Charles, made no comment, issued no statement, and did not request reinstatement. His silence, however, spoke volumes. Deep within the royal chambers, everyone recognized that the battle lines had been redrawn, and William had just executed his inaugural sovereign move without securing permission. Yet, to grasp the full extent of why William risked everything with this daring action, we must look back to a secret quarrel, a covert betrayal, and a woman who refused to be effaced. Camilla may be wearing a crown, but her journey to the throne was paved with unvoiced resentments and ruthless strategic maneuvers. When William contested her public image, he wasn't simply removing a painting, he was igniting a conflict she believed she had already secured victory in. What personal offense sparked Camilla's fury, and why did she once threaten to revoke the Queen's approval? The instant the news reached her, conveyed not by a courtier, but through a whispered leak from a junior aide, Camilla reportedly froze in her private drawing room. Then, according to palace insiders, came the rage, not theatrical, but cold, focused, strategic. Within moments, she demanded direct access to the king, bypassing the Lord Chamberlain and ignoring established protocol. Staff later described the Queen's voice as sharp and absolute. He must rectify this immediately. But Charles, perhaps already unraveling internally, provided no rapid resolution, and his inaction only intensified her anger. This transcended a mere portrait coming down. It was about a legacy being rewritten without her authorization. Camilla had invested years meticulously sculpting a controlled public image designed to erase the shadows of the past and solidify her position as queen in the eyes of tradition. And now, with one bold maneuver, William had ruptured that narrative with a single devastating stroke. To appreciate the depth of her reaction, one must recall the inner sanctums where Camilla slowly established her influence. Her ascent was marked not only by coronations, but by agreements, reconciliations, and quiet eliminations. She never openly challenged William, but her relationship with Catherine had always remained frosty beneath the smiles and handshakes. There were pointed looks, competing invitations, and strategically timed leaks. Catherine, the embodiment of the monarchy's graceful future, was never intended to overshadow the queen consort. And yet, with this painting, Catherine did more than overshadow, she eclipsed. While Camilla's official portrait was rigid, ceremonial, and veiled in neutrality, Catherine's was dynamic, commanding, regal in a way that felt predestined rather than assigned. What Camilla truly feared wasn't public admiration, it was erasure. Sources close to her recall her recounting an incident from years ago where she reportedly declared, "The next generation isn't ready for what this role genuinely demands." It was a statement dismissed at the time, filed away in a private journal. But now, with Catherine's portrait garnering praise from every corner of the kingdom, those words have re-emerged like a ghost. Did Camilla always doubt William and Catherine's strength, or was she simply marking her territory before the inevitable transition?
But perhaps the most chilling disclosure originates from within the Royal Collection Trust itself. Anonymous insiders have come forward alleging that Camilla had made subtle efforts over the years to influence portrait placements within key royal estates, not officially, of course, but through well-timed recommendations and gestures that subtly shaped the visual hierarchy of the monarchy's inner circles. The removal of her portrait was not just a personal slight, it was the destruction of years of symbolic groundwork. As she reviewed the reports of Catherine's unveiling, Camilla understood that this was not merely a change in art, it was the end of her uncontested control over perception. But the portrait itself, the image that now presides over the palace wall, was more than just art. It was a declaration, a coronation of a different sort. It had remained behind velvet curtains for over a year, known only to a handful of royal insiders. Catherine's portrait was not a commission, it was a prophecy. With regal poise and piercing defiance, it captured a future no one dared acknowledge until this moment. Who painted it, and why was it kept hidden from the public eye? The artist behind the painting was a name that had long caused disquiet within royal circles: Lucien Marlowe, an enigmatic painter whose reputation was built not on flattery but on fearless honesty. Marlowe once stated, "I don't paint crowns, I paint the soul beneath them." That very philosophy rendered him a dangerous choice for royal commissions, yet it was precisely why William sought him out. The meeting took place in secrecy, arranged via a third party, far from the gaze of the palace. William had only one instruction: capture her truth, nothing else. And from that whispered request emerged something far more potent than a portrait. It became an unspoken manifesto. What compelled William to act with such secrecy began months earlier, following a moment the public never witnessed. It was after a private royal function where Catherine had been publicly excluded from Camilla's inner circle of engagements, sidelined without explanation. That evening, William found her alone in the palace library, her hands tightly gripping a letter she never sent. She reportedly looked at him and said, "Let them erase me. I won't be erased in your eyes." It was then William decided that the world would view her on her own terms, through a medium they couldn't silence. The portrait itself communicated a narrative silently. Catherine stood without a tiara, divested of ceremonial adornments, yet not of power. Her gaze was level, not deferential. Behind her, subtly integrated into the canvas background, was the faint outline of the Spencer crest, a hidden homage to Diana's lineage. Her left hand, slightly advanced, bore no ring, no royal accessory, only a single sapphire thread woven into her sleeve. That thread matched the exact color of Diana's iconic engagement ring. None of these symbols were accidental, they were messages encoded in brushstrokes. And those who understood them knew this was not merely a portrait of a princess, this was an unspoken claim to sovereignty. Even more mysterious was the discovery found behind the frame itself. Taped to the back in a wax-sealed envelope was a note written in Catherine's own handwriting. Palace aides have not disclosed the full contents, but one excerpt was leaked through a trusted confidant. One day they will say it was only a painting. Let them. We'll know it was a beginning. The choice of words, measured and almost prophetic, suggests Catherine knew precisely what the painting would become long before its unveiling. For William, commissioning the portrait was not an act of rebellion. It was a matter of time. A time before others rewrote the monarchy's future in ink he hadn't endorsed. Those close to him say he expedited its completion, insisting, "I need this done before it's too late."
Too late for what? That question remains unanswered, yet deeply felt. And as this portrait was revealed to the public, it shattered more than just royal protocols. It shattered years of whispered hierarchy and reawakened an old alliance. Long regarded as the palace's quiet warrior, Princess Anne has always guarded her intentions closely. However, a clandestine conversation with Catherine, recorded in Anne's private journal, disclosed a pact forged not in ambition but in survival. And that pact would shape the entire gallery showdown. Anne had monitored the shifting currents of royal power with sharp, unblinking clarity. While others grieved, plotted, or posed in the months following Queen Elizabeth's death, Anne observed. She saw how Camilla expanded her influence through subtle gestures and strategic placements, curating her image image not just publicly, but deeply within the institution itself. The guest lists began to change, the seating arrangements adjusted, and the symbols that once quietly affirmed the late Queen's values were gradually supplanted by those that aligned more closely with Camilla's new reign. Anne never voiced direct opposition. She didn't need to. Her silence, rooted in discipline, spoke louder than any protest. But there was one moment when she chose to break that silence, a walk in the palace gardens. It was late spring. The trees were just starting to blossom, and the atmosphere held that peculiar, almost suffocating tension that precedes a storm. Catherine had confided her increasing sense of isolation, how her role felt more ornamental than active, how her presence was being softened and remodeled by others before she could define it herself. Anne listened, then offered a remark Catherine would never forget. "Let the people see you as you are before others redefine you." That moment was not ceremonial, it was ancestral. Anne, the one who never sought the spotlight, passed her silent torch to the woman she perceived as the last bastion of duty and grace. From that moment onward, the painting became more than William's act of loyalty. It became a mission of preservation. Unbeknownst to Camilla, it was Anne who later intervened during a procedural deadlock within the royal household. The placement of portraits within the Grand Gallery required a subtle but crucial procedural endorsement, normally a mere formality. But when resistance began to surface among those loyal to Camilla, Anne stepped in, not with confrontation, but with conviction.
She reminded them of the precedent, the sovereign right of the Prince of Wales to introduce legacy portraits, and more importantly, she reminded them of the monarchy's obligation to reflect continuity, not control. Her words carried weight, not because of their volume, but because of who spoke them. Anne's influence had always operated like an underground river, silent but capable of reshaping stone. Moreover, it was Anne's journal entry, later partially disclosed by a trusted royal archivist, that truly clarified her position. In a simple but poignant reflection, she wrote, "If they silence her, the thread unravels. She's the last unbroken line." It wasn't about Catherine's popularity, it was about her purpose. To Anne, Catherine wasn't just the next queen-in-waiting. She was the embodiment of a lineage too sacred to be diluted by palace games. Anne's quiet blessing didn't just protect Catherine, it neutralized Camilla's final hold on the ceremonial process. With her support, the portrait became inevitable, and once it was hung, no amount of protest could remove it without inciting institutional backlash. That was the brilliance of Anne's strategy. No noise, no spectacle, just undeniable positioning. But while Anne stood resolute in the shadows, the king himself was unraveling, trapped between duty, legacy, and the silence of a son no longer willing to yield. As portraits were exchanged and alliances exposed, King Charles remained publicly silent. Inside the palace, however, his silence masked a collapse of command. Torn between his wife and his heir, Charles was confronting a harsh reality. His crown may be worn, but it's no longer feared. The monarchy has long depended on the illusion of control, that within the gilded walls of Buckingham and Windsor, decisions are made from a place of unshakable authority. But in the days following the removal of Camilla's portrait and the rise of Catherine's, Charles's silence wasn't strategy, it was paralysis. Courtiers waited for a statement, a reaction, even a quiet directive behind closed doors. Nothing came, and the longer the king remained silent, the more unsettling that quiet became. Rumors began to circulate that Charles had begun hosting daily meetings, not with his customary advisors or courtiers, but with personal confidants and the Archbishop of Canterbury. The meetings, described as philosophical in nature, were anything but ceremonial. They were, according to a trusted source, the actions of a monarch wrestling with the reality that the future had arrived without his consent. The most damning evidence of his internal unraveling came from his own hand, a collection of handwritten notes discovered in his private study by a staff member. One chilling line included, "I can feel the crown tightening while the power slips through." Another note, scribbled and torn, read, "Am I being sidelined by a future already written?" These were not the words of a confident king. They were the confessions of a father caught between love and lineage, torn between his loyalty to Camilla and the surging force of William and Catherine's ascendancy. Every passing day without a royal rebuttal was interpreted by palace insiders as a passive surrender. And in a court where silence often carries greater weight than words, Charles's refusal to challenge the portrait's presence began to speak louder than any decree. But the consequences of his inaction didn't end with whispers. His presence in key ceremonial briefings began to diminish. Events he once commanded were now co-chaired or entirely led by William. Behind the scenes, Charles's influence over the royal collection and cultural representation was quietly being redirected to committees William had appointed. The monarchy was shifting its axis not through revolution, but through reallocation, and Charles was witnessing it happen in real time, unable or unwilling to stop it. Then came the reactivation of a little-known clause buried within the Protocol Clarion, an obscure but powerful document last amended during the reign of Queen Elizabeth. The clause restricted the Queen Consort's formal influence in gallery placements and ceremonial representation unless explicitly reaffirmed by the reigning monarch. Charles had the option to reaffirm Camilla's influence. He didn't. That omission, subtle yet seismic, was viewed by many within the palace as a quiet betrayal of his queen and a soft endorsement of Catherine's rise. And so the king, once expected to be the unshakable figure at the core of royal continuity, found himself retreating into a role he never anticipated, that of a monarch in retreat. His silence, once interpreted as strategy, transformed into something else entirely, a reluctant acknowledgement of a power he could no longer command. And yet, within that crumbling silence, a new force was taking shape. For William, this was never just about art. It was about justice. And behind that pursuit stood a woman whose sacrifices had remained hidden until now. She smiled in public, but behind palace walls, Catherine endured isolation, sabotage, and whispered campaigns aimed at diminishing her own status. Now, with her portrait unveiled, a surge of sympathy and fury has emerged, because for the first time her silence is no longer mistaken for weakness. For years, Catherine navigated a tightrope strung with unspoken rivalries and buried slights. While the public lauded her poise and elegance, few comprehended the orchestrated efforts behind the scenes to limit her influence. Camilla, having cemented her place beside the king, subtly tightened the circle of power. Catherine, despite being the future queen, was repeatedly excluded from strategic initiatives, ceremonial roles, and diplomatic trips, often with vague rationale or bureaucratic deferrals. Internal memos recently leaked from palace communication threads disclosed that Catherine had been deliberately removed from proposed travel rosters to international summits, despite her language fluency and growing global appeal. One aide anonymously admitted, her presence was seen as eclipsing the queen consort, and that made her a liability in certain eyes. The revelations weren't confined to correspondence.
What emerged next was more poignant. Several diary entries from long-serving palace staff surfaced, chronicling what one termed Catherine's haunted resilience. Notes described quiet moments in the royal residence, her being alone in the music room after official engagements, or waiting outside meetings she was no longer invited to. One entry simply read, "She wears armor you can't see." These weren't the theatrics of a scorned royal. They were the private records of a woman repeatedly undermined, who never retaliated publicly, but who felt every exclusion like a bruise beneath the skin. Behind her silence, William's anger intensified. What began as subtle concern escalated into something more visceral, more personal. He reportedly clashed with senior aides over her treatment, once slamming a folder shut and walking out of a strategy meeting when Catherine's name was omitted from a Commonwealth engagement plan. His frustrations weren't just about protocol, they were about justice. He had watched the monarchy treat his wife as a symbolic figure, a polished accessory, not as the capable partner she had always been. And it was from this fury that the idea for the portrait was conceived, not as a tribute, but as a reckoning. Then came the note, Catherine's own voice, penned and sealed behind the frame. One line in particular was shared across every news outlet and social platform within hours of the portrait's unveiling. "Let them see who I am when they no longer can silence me." It was the battle cry no one expected from the princess known for her grace. In that sentence, she reclaimed every part of her that had been erased behind palace curtains, and the world listened. Within hours, the internet erupted. Hashtags trended globally. Hashtag Our Future Queen. Hashtag The Silent Strength. Hashtag Stand with Catherine. Artists began recreating the portrait. News anchors shed tears reading the note. Polls showed a meteoric rise in public favor, not just for Catherine, but for the idea of her as a moral compass for the monarchy. What the institution had attempted to suppress for years had become its most powerful force. The public had chosen their queen, not through coronation, but through understanding. But with sympathy comes scrutiny, and as the power shifts, not everyone is standing still. Behind closed doors, Camilla was preparing her final countermove. You don't survive royal warfare by adhering to the rules. As Catherine's portrait captivated the public, Camilla quietly launched her counterstrike, not with words, but with leverage, hidden documents, whispered favors, and one planned appearance that could alter everything. Behind the velvet diplomacy of the monarchy, Camilla was preparing to reclaim the narrative that had slipped from her grasp. Her plan commenced with a high-profile charity gala, a cause closely aligned with her image and history, designed not merely as a public relations move, but as a loyalty test. Invitations were extended to senior royals, longtime patrons, and key media figures. It wasn't about raising funds. It was about counting who would stand beside her under the camera lights. Attendance, or the lack thereof, would speak volumes. Those who appeared on her arm that night would be seen as loyal. Those who didn't, as defectors to the Catherine camp. And Camilla was prepared to note every absence.
But her strategy wasn't limited to optics. Within weeks, palace corridors began to echo with whispers of a letter, an alleged legacy letter penned by Queen Elizabeth in her final months. Its contents were unknown, but insiders claimed it referenced Camilla's stabilizing role in Charles's later years and the Queen's private blessing for her continued influence beyond his reign. The existence of the letter had long been a point of speculation, but now, for the first time, there were murmurs that Camilla intended to leak it, not through official channels, but through a well-timed interview with a sympathetic royal correspondent. The objective wasn't to destroy Catherine's rising image, but to cast doubt on the sudden shift in public sentiment, a subtle, strategic reminder that Catherine was not the only woman ever endorsed by a sovereign hand. Meanwhile, internal memos began to surface, leaked by someone clearly within Camilla's faction. These documents indicated a push to have Camilla's portrait reinstalled, not in its previous location, but in a historical location rich with symbolic importance, the Queen's Gallery at St. James's, a move that would quietly elevate Camilla's image back into the royal canon, circumventing the controversy entirely. But what startled even seasoned palace watchers was the memo's tone. It wasn't a request, it was a demand. As the power chess match intensified, Camilla's inner circle hinted at something more explosive. Sources revealed she was prepared to expose confidential communications between key palace advisors and members of Catherine's team. Communications that could suggest premature planning for roles not yet sanctioned by the king. The implication? A coup in all but name. The threat was never made public, but it was received loud and clear behind palace doors. And finally, perhaps the most ruthless of all, was Camilla's threat to withdraw her support from several royal patronages if those same institutions began embracing Catherine's growing popularity. She understood one thing better than most. Isolation isn't always about exile. It's about removing the oxygen that sustains power. If she could make Catherine appear overexposed, overreaching, or too eagerly embraced, the narrative could turn. All she needed was doubt to take root. But Camilla's counterattack, for all its sharp edges, was built on an old foundation, one that assumed the palace still held the same power it once did over perception. What she didn't anticipate was that Catherine and William had foreseen this, and what they had in reserve wasn't just another painting, it was something far more dangerous, royal truth made visible. Hidden in the Spencer family vault for decades, a series of letters, sketches, and a sealed testament from Diana herself have now come to light. Their timing was no coincidence. Their contents, a chilling blueprint for the very moment William and Catherine are now experiencing. When the sealed envelope marked "For my son, when the storm begins," was retrieved from the ancestral vault on the Spencer estate, it was not treated as a mere family relic. It was an awakening.